All right. Thank you so much. Welcome to the 700th episode of the award-winning Sales Game Changers podcast. We got a treat for you today. I'm Fred Diamond. Of course, I'm the co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales and the host of over 700 Sales Game Changers podcasts. Kathy, even though this is number 700, we've actually done close to 750. We did a whole bunch of special episodes and on montages and all those things. But I'm very excited. Yeah, very excited because I'm here with my friend Kathy Obad, and she's going to take over the reins. She's going to do the interview for people on LinkedIn. You probably know her. She's an influencer up on LinkedIn. She has a great presence, gets a lot of interactions when she does things. I want to let the people know that we transcribe every Sales Game Changers podcast episode we've ever done. If you want to read the transcripts to any of the shows, go to salesgamechangerspodcast.com, salesgamechangerspodcast.com. And today, go to salesgamechangerspodcast.com/700. 700. Kathy, you're up in Canada. How much is that in Canadian, approximately?
That's so funny.
Tell us a little bit about you. Introduce everybody to you.
All right. Well, Fred, first of all, I just want to let you know what a pleasure and honor it is for me to host you on your 700th podcast episode. So thank you. And above all, congratulations. So I wanted to take this opportunity to go into a little bit of our history. As you mentioned, we've known each other for years. I've met you while I was working for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And right away, I knew that you were someone who was deeply passionate about both entrepreneurship and sales. You are the president of the Organization for Excellence in Sales. You're not only the president, you're a co-founder, which is pretty amazing. And you also lead the organization, the top. It's such an important one for B2B sales leaders in the world. So your impact in this field is absolutely quite remarkable. And one thing that I really love about your story and what resonated with me is when you started in 2017, your reason for starting, the reason why you wanted to start was it was a tool for your marketing. And I think that beautifully emphasizes it because it ended up being something so much more profound for you. And it really emphasizes something that I talk a lot about, where it's not about the destination in life, it's the journey. And through that journey, you discovered that you really like connecting with people and that you really like sharing their stories. And that became your focus. So it's not about not knowing or knowing where we want to go and how we're going to get there. It's following your passion and you will arrive. And I've always respected you. But when you published Love, Hope, Lime, it really hit me on another level. So I was going through a challenging time in my life, and I do share it a lot on LinkedIn. I was going through a challenging time in my life, and that book became a guiding light, not only for me, for both me and my daughter. You wrote it with such, oh man, it connected on a deeper level. It didn't just help us navigate our situation. I think it was a profound reminder that we're not alone in this. We're not the only ones facing these types of things. And I would recommend the book for anyone dealing with any hardship. You've written a lot. You've written a lot of books, but that one is going to be the top one for me, and it's closest to my heart because of my experience. Now, I am so excited to pick your brain and learn about your expertise and your insights. So, are you ready?
I am. And thank you so much. Actually, it's a great point you just made. We're talking about the 700th episode of the Sales Game Changers podcast, and you're extremely vulnerable and authentic on LinkedIn about things that have happened along the way with you. You talk about your childhood and, being the daughter of immigrants, and you just posted something recently about your mother's early years and things that she did to get established. Again, you're up in Canada. I'm down here in this. Have you always lived in Canada, by the way?
Yes, yes. And I kind of boring because I didn't move much from my circumference of where I started. So yes, I'm in Canada. I've
Yeah.
always lived there.
But you got such rich history, and you've also been through a couple of career changes as well since I've known you. You did some things and then you moved into cybersecurity, and we talk about sales a lot. And one of the things that we've done over our 700 sales game changers podcast episodes is we've had about 150 of them focused on women in sales. And my partner Gina Stracuzzi, who runs the Institute for Excellence in Sales, women in sales programs, would interview sales leaders. And you're right. I mean, the highlight of my day is doing interviews on the podcast. And we've started a second show called the Sales Story and a Tip podcast. And I recently did a show, which is sort of part of Sales Game Changers, where I talked to a guy named John Knotts, who wrote a book called Crossing the Zone of Fear. And we
Wow.
took his book, I read it, we sparsed it out to 7 different episodes. And that was a fascinating process, going through our fears and then how we overcome them. And I'm looking to do more of those, finding some great books that I could talk to the author about. So I appreciate your
Amazing.
following the
Amazing.
journey. Yeah.
No, it's amazing. You're definitely someone I look up to. So I'm so honored to be able to host this for you. So first of all, when you started in 2017, have you ever envisioned reaching this milestone of 700th episode?
I really didn't. The reason I started doing the podcast, and before the pandemic, I used to do them in person, and I would go to a VPs of sales office, and I really used it as a top of funnel things. I would say, hey, I'd like to interview you, VP of sales at Oracle or IBM or Microsoft, whatever it be. I have this new podcast. I'd like to come to your office, interview you. And before the pandemic, we did a lot of shows like, tell me about a great mentor. Tell me about a great sales success. What's something that you would recommend to your younger self? Things along those lines. And I really did it because I needed to meet sales VPs who are
Right,
my customers.
right.
Yeah, and they're my
Yeah,
customers.
what? It's not only clever, it's brilliant,
Oh,
but it's
thanks.
also bold,
Mm,
right? It takes a certain type of guts to step over that fear threshold
mm,
that you're talking about, pack your car with microphones and confidence enough to bring it, to walk in and bring it. And you also have to do your homework
yeah,
about the guy. You got to know what kind of
yeah.
questions to ask. So but it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing how it all started and why it all started. Now we're
you know,
here.
you were
Did you
here,
ever
and
think?
well, you know what though? I told you this before, I used to be a DJ. So I was very comfortable in front of a microphone. But you know what else? When I was in college, I was the editor of my college newspaper. College was Emory University down in Atlanta. And I love that. I thought I was going to go into journalism as a career. And the
Wow.
reason I'm telling you that is as I was doing these podcasts, yeah, the microphone, being bold in front of the microphone is one thing, but I was curious, right? And as a reporter, as a journalist, you have to have that curiosity. You want to find the
Yes.
truth. Same thing with the podcast. It's like, you know, tell me about a great story. And then what did you learn from that story? And how did you teach other people about that story? It's something you just mentioned. I really wasn't afraid to do the interview because I had to. If I wasn't going into the offices of these women and men, I wouldn't have built my business. We wouldn't have an institute for excellence in sales if I didn't start the podcast, because I don't know how else I would have met some of these people who have become friends over, we're doing today's interview in the summer of 2024. Some of them have become friends, like
Yeah, I
let's
believe
go have a
that.
drink type of a thing, and it broke down those barriers. And yeah, so good.
Wow, incredible. Absolutely incredible. So what would you categorize yourself as? More sales or more podcast storyteller editor? You're a man of many traits. I'm not even sure because what you're doing, you're pitching constantly, right?
Well,
I mean,
it's yeah,
and you
yeah.
beautifully are doing it because you're creating these great relationships and they're becoming your friends.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, um, I have an MBA in marketing. So I worked in my early stage of my career in marketing at Apple Computer for about 7 years, and Compaq Computer. but I always saw the value of sales. I knew even though I was in marketing, if sales didn't happen, the doors were going to close, right? Nothing happened until the sales was made. So I always knew, even as a marketer, that if I wasn't helping accelerate the sales process, then it would be a waste of time. When I
Brilliant.
created,
Always.
yep,
Yep.
yep, when I created the Institute for Excellence in Sales, it was mainly to get more leads. I was a outsourced marketing uh, officer. They used to call it, well, now they call it fractional, but I used to call it outsourced. Most of my companies, Kathy, were hiring me because they had sales problems. So I needed
Right.
to meet more salespeople. We created the Institute for Excellence in Sales. I needed to meet a lot more of them. I created the podcast. And in the beginning, a lot of these men and women, they do a lot of speaking in front of customers, in front of sales teams, but they've never really told their story. So I gave them an opportunity, and I like the way you brought that before. I gave them an opportunity to tell us, why are you such a great sales leader? What it is about you. Why would somebody want to work for you? Why would somebody want to partner with you? And why would a customer want to do business with you? And you don't become a VP of sales at Microsoft overnight. It's a
No,
15, 20, 30-year journey of relationships, hard work, preparation,
100%.
success. And I said to them, I'm going to give you a chance to tell the story, which you've probably never told to
Oh,
people. And
and we all love hearing good stories. I could see why your podcast is so popular because, oh, we all love good stories. So do toddlers, right? So excellent, beautiful. I love what you did. Now, reflecting on your journey, what do you believe has changed the most since your first episode?
yeah, that's a great question. I went back and I listened to some of the episodes, and when you do 700, you have a process, and like anything, I know what I want to get a message out from people, right? To be honest with you, the 700, there's only a handful of shows that I never ran. One show I produced, and the guy called me the night before and said, I just quit my job, don't run the show. I was like, okay. The only other episode that I can think of is I interviewed someone and I told him, give nice, short answers, no more than 30 seconds, because the number one audience is my audience. I always think about, one, is this a listenable show? Are
Right,
people going to, if people are giving me a half an hour of their time, I want to make the half hour work. If they're like on their bike, if they're mowing their lawn, if they're driving somewhere, if they're doing the dishes, whatever it might be, and I want to make it worthwhile for them, then I want to make it worthwhile for you, my guest,
right,
and then I want to make it worthwhile for the Institute. I mean, this isn't just, you know, it's just not a hobby. I mean, this is part of my business. It's part of my marketing activities.
right, right.
So one thing that's changed is I've gotten to the point where I really know how to get something of value from people so that the listeners will get value from that.
Oh, I love that. You know why everyone's most precious commodity is time. And if I'm giving
Yes.
it to you, even if it is on my bike, listening to your podcast, I could listen to another podcast. So
Right.
make it worth my while. So that's amazing. I love it. Now, for someone thinking about starting a podcast, what key insights, advice would you share? Is podcasting truly for everyone? Or are there particular traits or passions that lend themselves to this medium?
That's a great question. I learned relatively quickly that podcasting is a marketing tactic, right? And when people say to me, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast, I tell them two things. If it's to have fun, like you want to do a podcast with your wife about managing children, or if you want to do a podcast with your buddy about beer and basketball, just go have fun. Get a couple good mics, get a good place to put it, and have fun doing it. It's a lot of fun talking to
Right,
people
right.
about something
Yeah,
you're
it's
passionate.
been a great time.
But the other thing I tell people is, if it's part of your business, treat it seriously, the
Right,
same way you would treat any other marketing tactic. Get a good mic, know how to distribute, know how to give good interviews. A lot of people I've seen podcasters, they talk too much. And every show I've ever done, I've had a guest, right? Which is why I asked you to interview me. Every single show I've had a guest, and I've brought people on a couple of times, and I've had two or three guests on the same show. I don't do a show just me. Who cares about what I have to say, right? I don't even care what I have to say. I'm interested in VP of sales at Microsoft, VP of sales at Hilton, VP of sales at Oracle. Tell me what's important. Tell me what your customers want to hear. How are you working with customers now? I mean, we've been through a ridiculous amount of ridiculousness the last 4 years. Before the pandemic, we would tell stories. We would talk about a mentor. We would talk about lessons. When the pandemic kicked in, I wasn't meeting people in their office anymore. Everything shifted to doing the interviews over the internet. And I had to get to, what are you doing now? Because people who were listening were like, I don't know what to do. Let alone the beginning of the pandemic, even in the last 3 years, Kathy, people are still trying to figure out, okay, it's changed with how I talk to customers. How do I talk to customers today? How can I get in their office? How can I get them to pay attention to me? And also, people have changed. So if you're a great leader, how are you leading your people? People's urgency in getting information has still continued to drastically increase.
No, you're absolutely right. Now, out of your first 700 episodes, can you share any conversations that stand out that maybe inspired you or motivated you in some way?
Yeah, this was before the pandemic, and I tell people this all the time. My daughter was she's a competitive. When she was in high school, she was a competitive dancer. So she had a competition in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. So for people who do or do not listen, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee is the home of Dollywood, right? Dolly Parton's whole business enterprise is based in Pigeon
Oh,
Forge.
wow.
So I went to LinkedIn and I searched Dollywood, and I found the VP, well, she was director at the time of sales at Dollywood. Her name was Cordelia Marzak. And again, I was doing the interviews at the time in person. So I reached out to her via LinkedIn, our friend LinkedIn. And I said, hey, I'm Fred Diamond. I do this podcast. I'm going to be in Pigeon Forge because my daughter has a competition. I'd love to interview you for my podcast. And she got back to me and said, let me run it through our PR department. And she did. And she said, I'll meet you Sunday morning at 8 o'clock in Pigeon Forge in our offices, Dollywood offices. So I was like very excited. So I met her at 8 o'clock on a Sunday, and we did the interview in a conference room next to Dolly Parton's office. Right.
Wow.
And here's the thing. She just told, everybody loves Dolly Parton, right? There's nobody who doesn't love Dolly Parton. She was just inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She sold hundreds of millions of records. She donates millions of dollars to causes. There's very few people like her. And Cordelia just told stories about how kind she was, how Dolly Parton
Wow.
remembered everybody's name,
Wow.
and how they use that for sales, et cetera. But here's the twist that I tell people. Cordelia Marzak had very little LinkedIn presence. So a lot of the value of my podcast was interviewing people, and they would post it on LinkedIn. I would post and then they would share. Cordelia had maybe, yeah, she had maybe 100 connections on LinkedIn. So I used to joke it was probably my least listened to show of all time because no one could find her on LinkedIn. But I remember that interview to this day. It was 2018, maybe the summer, spring, probably, because my daughter was still in school. That was a great one. One other one, I interviewed a VP of sales at Adobe, and this was on January 6th, 2021. Now, if that day rings a bell, we did the interview at 2 o'clock. And at that point, people were watching us. We did the interviews over GoToWebinar, and I would get anywhere from 200 to a dozen people watching us physically do the interview. And then I
Oh,
would
wow.
convert it. Yeah. Then I would convert it to an audio podcast. There were times we had 400 people, and people would submit questions, and it was a lot of fun.
Oh, wow.
So we had 50 people register for this one. And I noticed that nobody's logging in. And we did the interview, and it was great. VP of sales at Adobe. It was a great interview. And then I said to him, I said, hey, man, this was great. I don't know why nobody logged in to watch us, but whatever. That was the day that the insurrection happened at the US Capitol, January 6th, 2021. So everybody was focused on, watching their TV to find
Oh,
out what was
wow.
going on in downtown DC. But I remember that was like, I was wondering where is everybody? We had 50 people register, but
That's
yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, and it's just funny. People's focus shift and everyone was worried. And yeah, there you have it.
But you
right?
know what though? You know what? Just what I'm asking is, almost every show I get excited about. I give people ground rules. I say, don't go too long. If it's a panel, give the other person some grace. But just don't if they don't talk too long, and they have something to say. And we do a lot of vetting, Kathy, before we bring people on the show. I get
Makes
40.
sense. Makes
Yep.
sense because people sometimes the story goes a little bit long and people can lose focus just because you're excellent at sales doesn't mean you have any presentation really for like so I get that. So it makes sense, right? And again, as you said, as an audience member, I don't have hours to listen to it, right? So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
often, when my son's talking, when he was little, I always used to say, land the plane,
Land the
land the
plane.
plane, get to the point, right? So yeah, absolutely. It makes sense that you'd have to have a process like that. Now, I need to know, out of the 700 first episodes, has there ever been a story that truly touched your
Mm,
heart
yeah.
and brought you to tears?
That's a great question. There were. I remember one. So, as you know, we do a bunch of shows with women in sales. I wrote a book about Lyme disease, and so I'm very in tune with people who have chronic illness. There was a show I did. It was in person. It was before the pandemic. It was with a woman in sales leader. And again, I was going to people's offices at the
Right.
time. And I'm not going to mention her name, but it was a woman in sales leader, a VP of a well known company. And she started telling me stories about how she was abused in the first part of her career when she was a young lady.
Oh,
And
dear.
she claimed to have been physically and verbally abused. And it was very touching. We had
Wow.
just created our women in sales program, and we work with amazing, successful, empowered women in sales. But in that environment, sometimes they'll talk about traumas and things that happen along the way where they weren't treated the way they should have been. And this particular woman was very forthright in what happened. And as we were doing this interview, I didn't see it coming. And
So
it was
she
like,
shared it during the interview, not
oh,
offline.
no, it was during the interview. I said, is there anything you want to talk
Wow.
about? I forget the exact question. It was something like, is there something from your early part of your career that you want to share that will give people some insights into how far you've progressed? And I remember she just went right into it. And I was like, in my head, I was like, oh, I didn't expect that. And
That's
I didn't know
wow.
that. And the microphone is recording, or the recorder is recording. So she obviously wanted to tell it. She knew we were recording. And I don't know how
Wow.
much of a story it was in her life publicly, or at least within her family and friends. And I remember like, I remember I hugged her afterwards. And
Oh,
um, yeah, there's like some stories like that. There's been some stories where I used to ask, tell us about a mentor. And there's some stories where people would reference a mentor, some cases a parent, who was very like a father who obviously was now passed on. So there was a
right.
lot of that was one that would usually get a lot of my guests would be choked up about that
Of
and the
course.
communication.
You know what? They're ready to share. They're ready to share it with you and with everyone else, and it becomes part of their therapy, I believe. Wow, impactful. Do those stories get listened to more? Has it like what would you say? What are your top listen to topics, or is it emotion that makes your audience go for it?
You know what? It's mostly the person. So of the 700 shows, we post it up on Apple Podcasts, which about 80% of audio podcasts go through Apple. And then there's
Right,
Spotify and Google, and there's about another dozen smaller ones. So every show I do gets at least, depending on the last 6 years, anywhere from 500 to 2,000 downloads just as a show. As you
right,
know, I post every show on LinkedIn.
right,
And if the sales leader is loved, right? I've
right,
interviewed a couple of sales leaders who maybe they were a sales leader at two or three different companies at the highest level. And I remember I interviewed a guy named Mark Weber, who was the president of NetApp USA. And I think he might have been at Sun and some other companies. Uh, and people love this guy. And
right.
when I interviewed him, he had retired. And excuse me, he was teaching sales at the Catholic University of America. So we did the interview down at CUA. It was a great interview. He's a smart guy. We then took a picture of the basilica on the campus of the Catholic University of America. It's one of my favorite pictures that we've ever done. And that show got like 20,000 downloads because this guy was well known and he had to have supported. And then people shared my LinkedIn post. And that's usually the way. It's even some of like the best interviews, maybe they be number 300. A lot of times
Right.
it's like for example, there's a guy named Brian Ludwig, uh, who's a VP of sales at a company called Cvent, and they have a couple hundred salespeople. And here was Brian, and I tell my guests this: you're telling things that people don't normally get to hear you say. Spread it around your company, right? Send it to your partners, so that
Yeah.
they can listen to it and know who you are.
Yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. Now, beyond simply podcasting episodes, what creative marketing strategies have you found effective in promoting your podcast? Like, how do you go about that?
Like I mentioned before, a podcast it's a marketing tactic for your business. For people like me, I did the podcast mainly to get leads for the Institute for Excellence in Sales, and my customers are VPs of sales. So by being in an intimate setting with them in their office, even over Zoom, talking about why they're so great, I'm doing it's called the reciprocal bias. So they want to help, right? So then
Yeah.
I go back to them. Yeah, I go back to them. I've started a little different now. Even before I do the interview, I talk a little more about the Institute for Excellence in Sales, but at least afterwards, I'll say, hey, we have a program coming up for women in sales. If you have women on your team, you should send them to this particular program. I wrote a book called, you mentioned in the intro that I've written 2 books. I wrote a book on Lyme disease awareness called Love, Hope, Lyme. And I wrote a book called Insights for Sales Game Changers. And we took the top lessons from the first 425 shows and put it into a book. And
Wow.
yeah, and it's on Amazon and it's sold, but um, I've gone to IES customers and signed books in their
Beautiful.
office. Yeah. So there's a lot
Beautiful.
of things you
What
can
a
do with the
valuable
content.
book to have. Like, it's not just your insights, it's 400 episodes. Brilliant. I love it. Now, looking back, any regrets with things that maybe you could have done a little bit differently in your podcasting journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. All these are great questions, by the way. Good job. Um, Again, talking today with Kathy Obad, who's a good friend on LinkedIn, has a great following. You're doing a wonderful job. You should have a podcast. If you haven't started, I don't know what you're waiting
I'm
for.
actually taking notes, Fred. I'm going to listen to this later and I'm going to use all your strategies.
I think you definitely should. The only regret is, I'll tell you a funny story. When you start a podcast, you have all these ideas, and obviously there's like Joe Rogan, who's like the number one podcaster in the world. Millions of people listen to his podcast, and I remember thinking when I was starting it in 2017, maybe it's going to slip through the cracks, and it
Right,
won't just
right.
be a niche; it'll be like a million listener podcast. I became friends with the guy at the time who had the top sales podcast. And I actually even arranged to meet him. And my main question was, how many downloads, which is basically the word for listens, do
Right.
you get per episode? I expected him to say, I get a couple million or 500,000. And I said to him, how many downloads do you get per show? He said, on a good day, I get 800. And I was like, oh, all right. I guess I'm not going to be the next Joe Rogan. So I said, I'm not going to make a fortune on the podcast. And very few people do. I mean, I've had sponsors. Cox Communications has sponsored programs over the years. And again, I use it as a main lead generation source for companies to become partners, members of the Institute. One thing I might have done is I might have written a book quicker. I published the book in 2022, which was 5 years after I started. So I've been thinking about writing a book since almost from day one because I'm building all this
Right.
content. Maybe
Right. Yeah.
I could have done a little quicker. I might have done more on social media. I mean, I do LinkedIn. I don't know how much of an audience there is for what I'm doing on TikTok or Instagram, but I might have done more social media because what's amazing is a lot of times, again, I run an organization called the Institute for Excellence in Sales. When someone says something, I think to myself, yeah, that makes sense. But a lot of
Right.
times I'll see people post on our friend LinkedIn or Instagram, make 3 phone calls a day, make 3 more phone calls a day. And then there's like 1,000 likes, 1,000 comments. I'm like, duh, but not everybody knows. And they might listen to somebody a different way. So I might have done more than that. But generally I'm pleased. I mean, it's helped us grow the business. We've made a lot of friends. I could probably reach out to 90% of the people, Kathy, that I've interviewed on the show and have a conversation with them, um, either just for fun or for business.
Oh, Fred, I would go beyond saying just pleased with how far you've come. I think it's pretty remarkable, and I think you're a pretty busy guy, and I think what you've done and the life that you've created for yourself, because I don't just think it's a 9 to 5 and we leave work behind. It's making sure we love what we do every single day. And you're connecting and you're sharing people's stories and you're sharing it with an audience. It's a really fantastic thing, and I don't think you missed out on any other social medias. I think you found exactly what you needed to do, and I think it's amazing thing, which brings me to how has podcasting transformed you
Mm.
personally and professionally, because it really was a big part of you for years.
That's another great question. It's again, I wrote the 2 books, the line book and the sales book in 2022. And the sales book was a result of doing 450 some odd episodes of the podcast. When I published the line book, to further elucidate and get the messages out there, I created a podcast. So I also do a podcast called the Love Hope Line Podcast, where I interview advocates, doctors, people who've created Lyme communities. And I get like thousands of downloads per show. It's a different market.
Wow.
I hate to use the word market. It's different community. There's a lot of information out there. If you want to get better at sales, you could type in sales improvement. There's like a million things that come up. I love when someone says to me, if I reach out to them and I say, hey, you're a VP of sales at, you know, Sony or whatever it might be, love for you to be on my podcast. And they say, and they reply back with, oh yeah, I remember that episode you did with John Smith. And that was episode like number 327. He said, yeah, I used to work for John. I remember you did that. I listened to it a couple of times.
Wow.
Or people say, hey, I've listened to, because you don't think about it in those terms. It's like, okay, I'm interviewing Joe Smith because I want Joe Smith to become a member, a customer of the Institute for Excellence in Sales.
Right,
But
right.
sometimes you forget that the show's out there. And one of the fun things I like to do as well is a podcast is forever. So
Yeah,
it's out there. People, when they search, let's say they search Joseph Sales, it's a good chance my podcast is going to come up. And
sure.
I track every week the number of interactions. Sometimes I'll see Joe Smith's show just got 50 interactions, even though I posted it 3.5 years ago, Kathy. And I'll reach out to Joe. I'll say, are you hiring or something? Because,
Ah, that's so funny.
and they always say, yeah, how do you know? I'm like, well, because your podcast just got 20 new listens. And we did the show 3.5 years ago. There's no reason why, unless they want to maybe do business with you, but usually it's because they're looking to work for you, or maybe they're going to hire you or something.
That's a beautiful thing. The information is out there. And I love that you had your Lyme also podcast, because I don't think there's enough of that. And dealing with both my daughters and their autoimmune diseases, there's not much support. So having that, I can see that as being a tool for many people, and how things might hit someone is going to be different for everyone. Yeah, it's a great tool if I'm job searching to see and hear their voice and hear how they speak and hear. So amazing. Well done. I love it. Now, as you reflect on your journey, are there any final thoughts of wisdom
Mm.
you'd love to share with aspiring podcasters, like maybe me or maybe your audience? What would you like to leave people with? What words of wisdom?
No, that's a great point. And for listeners, we end every show. I'll say, hey, Kathy, you did a great job. You gave us so many great bits of advice. Give us a final action step people should do right now to take their sales career to the next level. I'm going to say 2. One is, one of the key messages, Kathy, that keeps coming across every single show we do is that you need to communicate your value. And customers can get information over the internet. They can get it on social media. The role of the sales professional has changed. Customers don't need you to talk about features. They don't need to have you talk about benefits. They need you to talk about how can your solution help them achieve their goal, whatever it might be, growing the
Sure.
business, saving money, moving into new markets. If it's public sector, educating students better, if it's government, uh, achieving the mission of the agency, whatever it might be. So as you're out there, sales professionals or business owners or solopreneurs, think constantly. It's not about you. It's
No,
about the value you're providing. And the last bit of advice, which actually is one for you, I wrote two books. I was 60 years old, Kathy, when I wrote my first two books. And people were like, what took you so long? We thought we were going to do this. If you
that's
think
so
about
funny.
if you're thinking about writing a book, write a book. If you're
I
thinking
know
about
you and I spoke about that already, and I'm like, yeah, Fred, a book's coming.
and if you're thinking
So
about if you're thinking about starting a podcast, start a podcast. It's really easy to do. All you need is a good microphone, and you could do them over Zoom. And I host them on the audio ones. You have to host on a provider, but you can go right to YouTube. And for someone like you, Kathy, think about the messaging that you do every day on LinkedIn about health and about relationships. And you also, post sometimes about your business, cybersecurity, and you know, what it's like to be a mom and your children. You have such a presence about you that you could easily do some kind of show and get a listening. And get a following relatively quickly. You have a presence about you on camera. You like to post pictures, when you do your posts of yourself out there and driving. And, you should think really hard quickly. Again, we're doing today's show on September 19th, 2024. Yours would fly. And I see from the people, the reason I asked you to do the interview with me is, you post something, next thing you know, an hour later, there's 100 comments, right? Everything you post. And the other thing is, the last thing is, I tell people this: if one person listens to my podcast, then one person listens to my podcast, and I'm impacting one person. Now I want thousands, but if you're making a difference with one person, and I know that the Sales Game Changers podcast has done that because people have told me. I know that the book has done that because people have told me. Some people tell me they read it before they go on a sales call. And the Love, Hope, Line book, I know that's impacting lives in a very, very challenging world. And anything we could do to make the world a better place is a good thing.
beautiful. So, Fred, your words of wisdom. Number one, if you impact one person, job well done. If you changed their world for the better, applaud yourself. And second, like Nike says, just do it. So is this a
Let's do
dare?
it.
Am I dared to do a podcast? And I also
Yeah.
want to know, when's book number 3?
Yeah, it's interesting. After I published the line book, I got like 20 suggestions for the follow-up book. Love, Hope, Chronic Illness, Love, Hope, MS, Love, Hope,
Yeah,
Dementia,
I
whatever it
could
might
see
be.
that. I could
I think
see that.
I think what we're going to do is I wrote the book relatively quickly. It's won a couple of awards. It's given me friends all over the world. I think what I'm going to do is I probably need to update it, even though it's only been out for 2 years. Since I've started doing the Love Hope Line podcast, I've learned much more about
Wow,
the
wow, wow.
complications. So yeah, it's probably going to be the next one, volume 2 or
Wow.
whatever.
Amazing. I can't wait to pour over it. Like fascinating, amazing. Thank you. Thank you for everything. Thank you for inviting me to host today. It has been an incredible pleasure. I had so much fun. Congratulations on your 700th episode. Amazing, my friend. You are truly an inspiration to all of us. Thank you for your words of wisdom and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Kathy Obad. My name is Fred Diamond. This is the Sales Game Changers podcast.